Bartolomé de las Casas was a Dominican missionary in the New World in the 16th century. He was one of the first people in history to advocate for universal human rights, decrying the enslavement of the native peoples and demanding their freedom. For this, many have remembered him as the protector of the Indians. Unfortunately, this is not all he did nor all he is remembered for. For some, he is less affectionately referred to as the father of the African slave trade. The reality is that Las Casas was a complicated figure from a complicated time. As much as some would like to canonize him a saint and others condemn him a criminal, the past isn't always that simple. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't carry on his legacy. Let's reclaim some history. From even his childhood, the life of Bartolomé de las Casas was entangled with the sins of the New World. When he was just 9 years old, he was in Seville when Christopher Columbus returned with enslaved members of the Taíno tribe. When Columbus left on his second voyage, Las Casas' father and uncle were among those who joined him. Their work was to establish the hacienda system, estates that exploited slave labor for agriculture and manufacturing, and it made the family quite wealthy, affording Las Casas the opportunity to attend the most prestigious schools in his pursuit, of all things, to become a priest. Meaning that Bartolomé de las Casas was able to become a priest, in large part, because he benefited from the system of slavery. That is not an insignificant detail. At the time, though, there seemed to be no conflict in his eyes or in the eyes of the larger society. He eventually immigrated to Hispaniola in 1504, became an owner of an hacienda that used slaves himself, and was ordained a priest in 1510. At first, there was nothing about his priesthood that conflicted with owning slaves. It was an entirely normal practice at the time. But something began to change. In 1510, the Dominican friars arrived in Hispaniola and refused to hear the confessions of slave owners. In Advent 1511, Friar Antonio de Montesinos denounced the Spanish economic system and slavery itself as a mortal sin. For a few years, Las Casas fought against these men, complaining directly to the King of Spain himself, but his eyes were opened in 1513 when he served as a chaplain in the conquest of Cuba. He later wrote, "I saw here cruelty on a scale no living being has ever seen or expects to see. The system as he knew it could no longer be justified." He began preaching himself of the immorality of slavery, calling it a mortal sin. He renounced his ownership of the hacienda, traveled to Spain to convince the king to protect the native peoples, and published a work in defense of the native peoples, Memorial de Remedios para los Indios, recommending, first and foremost, a complete moratorium on the use of Indian labor. Las Casas would spend the rest of his life dedicated to the Indian peoples, founding communities of free Indians and Spaniards living together. In 1542, he convinced the Holy Roman Emperor to sign legislation that prohibited taking natives as slaves, outlawed all new encomiendas, and made them no longer transferable, meaning that when all the current owners died, the system would dissolve. Unfortunately, his efforts were never fully successful, but his zeal for the people and demands for justice earned him the reputation among many as a saint, providing, in their eyes, the early foundation for concepts like religious freedom and universal human rights. Of course, no one is ever as holy as one's followers claim, and Las Casas is no exception. As much as these works can be used to portray him as a progressive, justice-minded revolutionary, they also betray his blind spots. Of the recommendations he provides for protecting the Indians, one of them was to replace them with African slaves. Critics have long argued that Las Casas was not some humanitarian hero fighting for human rights. He was just a savvy businessman. His denouncement of the enslavement of Indians, they say, is not for care of the Indians as people, but a recognition that they were weaker and more susceptible to disease. It made far more economic sense to enslave Africans, whom he deduced were more fit for grueling labor. Since the transatlantic slave trade began to increase in this time, some historians have attributed its rise to Las Casas' influence, dubbing him the unfortunate title, the father of the African slave trade. Yikes. What do we make of this? It's not entirely clear. Despite his suggestion, he was by no means the first to propose the idea, as Africans were already being used as slaves. Besides this, the use of African slaves remained relatively small for the next 100 years, ballooning into what we think of it today in 1619. It's unlikely that his proposal in 1516 is the driving force behind it, and he later wrote in 1561 that he knew it was a grave mistake. "I soon repented and judged myself guilty of ignorance. I came to realize that black slavery was as unjust as Indian slavery, and I was not sure that my ignorance and good faith would secure me in the eyes of God. So yes, he later repented, but you can't deny that he did propose it in the first place. Regardless of whether he is the reason for its proliferation or not, there's no question that this is a blemish on his reputation as a protector of human rights. How can one be a saint for humanity and still advocate for slavery? This is a troubling contradiction. It's for this reason that many in our world today would prefer that we just forget about Bartolomé de las Casas. As noble as his work was for the Indian people, it's simply unfathomable that we could glorify someone who, at any point in their life, supported slavery. It's just repugnant to us. And yet, it's a perfect example, I think, of the dangers of judging the past by the standards of the day. There's no doubt that if Las Casas lived today, advocating now what he advocated then, he would be ridiculed, and rightly so. But he didn't live today. He wasn't born into a world where slavery is repugnant and unimaginable. He was born into a world in which it was the norm. Here was a man who had every reason to support it, to find a way to make it work. It allowed him to go to the best schools, provided him with extensive wealth, was supported by his government and everyone he knew. And yet he chose to renounce it. He chose to put his life at risk in renouncing it. His conception of human rights was by no means fully formed at the time of his conversion, and he continued to make mistakes. He persisted in evil for some time, and may have even died far from what we consider today a more perfect conception of justice. But we inherited that sense of justice. He didn't. He had to swim upstream. He had to figure it out himself, fighting off people on all sides telling him that he was wrong. Any moral high ground that we can claim today above him can only come because there were people like him who were willing to take a stand before us. My guess is that he was a bit of an opportunist and could be morally self-righteous at times. He certainly benefited from slavery all throughout his life and probably did some things that made life worse for a lot of people. He was by no means a perfect man. But that doesn't mean that his life isn't worth remembering, even emulating. What makes Las Casas significant today is not that he had it all figured out or that he was some morally pure person. It's that he shows how conversion is ongoing and probably never complete. Even as an advocate, he made mistakes. Even when he thought he was being selfless for others, he later realized that he was still causing harm. In a world today where racism and injustice remain normative, where even those advocating for social justice still benefit from it, the complexity of this man might be exactly what we need, reminding us that there is still more to learn, that there will be another generation after us, probably condemning us for not going far enough. Before we exalt or condemn this man, it might be good to ask, how will history remember us?